Warren, welcome back to the show. Obviously, not your first rodeo with Informed Performance, but yeah, welcome back to the show. Different, same guest, different host. It's my turn to interview you today.
That's it, Andy. It's always a pleasure, buddy. Thanks for having me back.
Obviously, you've been on before, as said, but can you just kind of give us a quick walkthrough of your background, just to give context, if this is someone's first time encountering you?
Yeah, of course. I'll keep it short and sweet. So I spent a career working in professional sports, including Premier League teams, international rugby with England, did the Olympic cycle, and my role was as an exercise physiologist slash nutritionist. But simultaneous to that, I did my PhD in exercise physiology. And essentially, what happened was I came across the technique, which you've probably heard of, called blood flow restriction, and it kind of just really caught my interest because of the underpinning physiology was really interesting. So I started asking questions. I started saying, well, why aren't we leveraging that for healthy athletes, for performance outputs, strength, speed, power, hypertrophy, recovery, all these things that the literature told us it could do. And someone just showed me a cuff and said, try do it with this. And it was a big, bulky, wired, machine-based cuff, which are incredibly effective, but incredibly complex and cumbersome. You can't scale it. It's one-on-one with supervision. So long story short, I worked out a way to integrate that type of tech into a wearable, streamlined it, built the research into it so you don't need to worry about pressure because it's integrated. And now with those products, we service several hundred, I think it's 450 plus professional teams around the world, collegiate teams, most of the Premier League, NFL, NBA. We're at the World Cup currently with lots of teams. So yeah, we've actually been off planet with SpaceX and NASA too. So a bit of a whirlwind journey from sports science to space there.
No, an incredible journey. And obviously, we've had Raj on before with Pete talking about Hytro, more from a leadership and business perspective. You've been on before with Steve Barrett, I think, doing kind of like a sports science BFR Hytro episode. What's going on with Hytro? I know it's a really busy time at the moment. I saw the Jude Bellingham stuff last week of him snapped in some shorts. What's going on in your world at the moment?
Oh, mate, it's gone bananas, to be honest, and it's incredible, the experience actually. So for the kind of lead up to the Mexico game, Sky Sports News had papped essentially the whole team wearing Hytro on the bikes, doing a bike flush. And there's this image of Jude Bellingham pulling up his top, and you could just see this Hytro branded logo, this waistband. It's just all over the news. And all of a sudden, it's popped off everywhere. So, the Times, the Sun, the Daily Mail, the Sky Sports News, of course. We're getting interviews. I've just come off the back of a live BBC interview literally half an hour before this, and my heart's still absolutely pounding. But it just shows you the virality of something like the World Cup, right? There's so many eyeballs on it. And while we've worked with England for a long time, it's that particular moment that's caught the interest of the media, and it's just blown up. So yeah, it's pretty mental. It's pretty mental. Very exciting though.
Yeah, I mean, I know something's gone mainstream when my wife, who's not remotely interested in this podcast at all, not interested in physical performance, and sort of my wheelhouse. She saw the Jude Bellingham photo, like I'm sure many people did, and suddenly is very interested in Hytro. So I can only imagine that's reflective of it blowing up.
Yeah, I mean, he's a good-looking fella, and he's got his rig out on, and Hytro is essentially compression shorts. So yeah, it's an interesting visual, isn't it? Mate, it's really funny actually, because there's so many thirst trapping accounts, and obviously because of my feed, it's a lot of Hytro. I'm just getting these images of Jude Bellingham half naked in the products all the time, all throughout the day. But look, exposure's great, right? So I'm happy.
It's just the algorithm, it's just, whatever you're into.
That's it.
Obviously today's not like it's not going to be like a huge BFR episode. We're going to talk kind of more broadly about physiology. And I can't remember where we caught up with this, but obviously you're going to be doing some physiology episodes with us soon, which is going to be fantastic. I can't actually remember if I confirmed that with you or not, but we'll just throw it in the episode as we go.
I think we verbally confirmed it, mate. I'm delighted to be joining you doing some episodes.
Cool. Well, the listener gets to hear this in absolute real time, so that's good. Obviously the World Cup is on, as everybody knows. Compared to the kind of regular season, and specific to athletes being at tournaments as a whole, whether that's other sports or not, with your kind of physiology hat on, what are the big challenges or the sort of physical considerations that they need to get right? There's probably a laundry list of considerations that they have to think about going into these big events.
Yeah, gosh, where do we even start? The challenges are endless, really. particularly off the back of like really punishing seasons. Like they've only just finished and now they're going straight into a World Cup, a lot of these athletes. So they're already accumulated fatigue. They're then flying and traveling. I think England are traveling 6,000 or something miles throughout the whole of the World Cup there and back, etc. So that fatigue cost on the body is huge. And you can see that in like HRV data and like sleep quality. So that's already a disadvantage, right? So if we can mitigate the impacts of fatigue and jet lag, etc., that's already a kind of an ergogenic aid or it's supportive of those athletes, right? So there's a lot of teams and coaches looking for ways to mitigate jet lag in their athletes. And that's just one thing. So, the quick turnaround between games, how do we restore neuromuscular function between those games so they can go out and perform again? How do we freshen up the legs so perceptually they feel more ready to go out and perform again? How do we mitigate injury risk, right? If we're putting these high demands and lows through the tissues, is there an increased injury risk? And these are all things going through the coaches' heads, and they have to, I'm sure they have planned for these eventualities.
Yeah. Let's maybe zoom in and sort of double click on some of these kind of like one at a time, and then we can kind of, form a pretty comprehensive view of all of them.
Yeah.
In terms of sort of like the accumulated fatigue, jet lag, obviously that's a huge topic. There's lots of different techniques, products, considerations teams can make. I think like one of the things we're probably seeing a lot with this current World Cup, especially is jet lag and time zone shifts.
Yeah.
What are the sort of different ways that you've seen that are maybe effective at minimizing fatigue? Obviously, teams themselves can't really control the schedule, so they've got to kind of react to what's in front of them and put in place a system.
Yeah, there's obviously a few different tacks that you can take. I mean, one would be simply the time you're awake and when you're waking up and going to bed, like programming that and actually looking a few days out, where do I need to be in time zones and try and shift it towards that. And there's incredible apps like Phase app, which is a good friend of mine, Dr. Tom Clark, who's created a way to like, it tells you when to expose your athletes to light or when to turn it dark. So you'll have eye masks and light on an iPhone, for example, just to get the hormones around the body, get the body in a physiological state that it thinks it's awake or going to sleep, for example. Something I used to do with Dan Howells at England Rugby Sevens, because they travel a lot, right? They're traveling all over the world for Sevens competitions. We used to have nutritional strategies whereby we'd give them certain foods that they'd be expecting to have at that time of day. So if it was, a breakfast time that we're entering, we'll give them a breakfast type meal or a lunch or a dinner. Even if it's 3 a.m, we're trying to move them onto that time by getting their bodies kind of accustomed to what they should be having at those particular times. There's a bit of literature around that as well. And it seems to have an impact. People are using melatonin, people are using sleeping tablets to actually just knock them out. But for me, that's not the best thing to be doing, because you don't get the proper stages of sleep completed when you use their sleeping tablets. But the really big one for me, and obviously this is exercise physiology hat, but it's also BFR because it is an important point, is when you're sat at about a 90-degree knee bend for such a prolonged period of time, it impacts circulation, right? And you get this accumulation of lymph in the legs and the ankles and the feet. We need to clear that, because the accumulation of that is going to cause inflammatory markers to flood the body and the tissues, which is, really stressful for the body. So blood flow restriction is actually something that you can do to enhance that circulation. So by strapping in, essentially applying that pressure, causing the swelling in the tissue, and then releasing a strap, you're going to get a powerful flush. And when you flush those blood vessels, you're going to get something called reactive hyperemia, which is essentially, let's go back a stage. When you create the flush, you get this friction across the blood vessels. That friction is called shear stress. When you create shear stress, the body reacts by dumping nitric oxide into the bloodstream, which causes vasodilation, which allows you to pump more blood through the vessels into the tissues containing oxygen, glucose, amino acids, etc. So if we do that on a cyclical dose throughout the flight, we're actually enhancing blood flow to freshen up the body, essentially. And if you think about blood flow, it's the central regulatory highway in the whole body. It's like a motorway. So it's not just the muscle tissues. It's actually impacting the brain. It's impacting cognition. We believe it's impacting sleep and HRV. So we're doing research right now to understand, is there an impact on HRV kinetics from doing this protocol? Is there an impact on sleep quality, sleep length, duration, the stages of sleep? We hypothesize that's a yes. We don't know. But what we do have is great anecdotal data to say that people are feeling better and fresher that next day, having had done the flushes. And then you have other techniques like our friends at Firefly as well. So EMS kind of stimulation on the nerve in the leg. And that's just giving you that continuous calf pump. And again, that's going to help with keeping circulation around that body while you're at this knee bend, while you're kind of, stagnant essentially. Yeah. So, I mean, there's just a few ways that I've seen people kind of trying to mitigate jet lag.
You mentioned within that like a sort of nitrogen or nitrate effect. Instagram is wildly putting stuff out there at the moment. There's a lot of just stuff about all angles of performance and health and stuff, especially with the Mexico game that, in real time
Yeah.
recording now, that was last night at the Azteca. Obviously, great win for England that we're both happy about.
Let's go.
One of the many trivial Instagram things that I've seen is like the use of Viagra. I can't believe that's making a word appearance in this show. Obviously there's things like L-arginine, beta-alanine. There's lots of different sort of like vasodilators that are used supplementary wise in performance. Whether the Viagra one's true or not, who knows? But how much of that is useful kind of, in tandem with, trying to clear an athlete out lymphatically? How much of that can you kind of stack in and maybe get like an increased marginal gain through its use?
Yeah, I think there's definitely utility in it. I think the issue is you have to load those types of things. You have to say multiple doses, multiple days in a row for that to have any impact of significance.
Yeah.
There might be some literature, now I'm really thinking back here a long time, around a bolus dose that has some kind of impact. But I believe the gold standard is repeated doses, like 3 a day over like 5 days or something. Now, the problem with that is getting an athlete to do it. So, like, there's so many things happening, their media appearances, family, friends, they're away for a while, they're preparing to go. It's just, there's a lot to think about. So when you're adding friction points, like make sure you take this 2 or 3 times a day and this is the dose, it just adds another friction. So for me, yes, there is scientific evidence and utility, but is it practical? And does it give a meaningful outcome, even in the best situations and circumstances? I don't know, perhaps. But again, if we're trying to throw the kitchen sink at this, then there's no harm as long as it's dosed properly. So I don't see why they wouldn't.
Yeah.
So I'm on the fence, if I'm honest. And I think what I'm getting at is kind of the undercurrent point here is you can have the best products in the world, but if they don't fit the workflows or make it simple and easy for an athlete or coach to administer, that's a friction point and it's probably not going to be done. Consistency beats perfect science every single time, in my opinion.
Yeah. No, I love that. I want to kind of rattle through all of them today. There's a lot of things we could talk about. So I want to kind of keep us moving through all the different, physiological considerations that teams have at tournaments. One of the things you mentioned earlier was neuromuscular function. I think there's lots of ways that probably we think of that in our home environments where we've got, force plates and different tools like that, where we can travel with them to games we're driving at, or we've got them in our home kind of facilities and stadiums. There's other parts to neuromuscular sort of readiness as well, but how does that get maybe looked at and intervened with, perhaps in like the World Cup context?
Yeah. Well, I'm going to speak to the footage from England using the BFR on the bike again, purely because we've actually just published some research in this area, and it was around neuromuscular restoration, which is really interesting. So we shared that with them prior to the tournament, which is one of the reasons I'm assuming why they're using it. I'm not allowed to state that they're definitively doing anything, so I'm assuming. Essentially, what the research did is they used a recovery bike flush, which was 10 minutes of continuous bike at 90 revolutions per minute at 1 to 1.5 watts per kilo. They then repeated that with BFR applied for 10 full minutes continuously. They then repeated that with BFR applied intermittently for 3 rounds. So that was 3 rounds of 3 minutes and 20 application and 2 minutes unrestricted for the flush and reperfusion to occur. So they were all matched load for the time under kind of locomotion, let's say. And the final condition was just a complete passive sit down rest, no BFR. And what they looked at was the bar velocity of a back squat and the bar velocity of a hip thrust. They looked at RSI on CMJs and they looked at RPE. And what they found was only the BFR condition that was used intermittently restored neuromuscular function. They actually restored it far beyond baseline, so it's super compensated. So what we believe to be happening is that flush and reperfusion of the BFR is enabling us to restore neuromuscular function quicker than just a bike flush alone. And that's really interesting. Now, we don't know the underpinning mechanism here. We need to do a proper lab-based biopsy type study, I'm sure, or something like that to find out. But definitively, the data is incredibly strong, and it was very significant. And not only was it acute straight after the bout, it was a full day later, they saw a pronounced difference in that neuromuscular restoration. So because of that, we now see a lot of teams all over the world, particularly at the World Cup, like I said, there's like the Socceroos doing it as well, and others, using blood flow restriction on a bike intermittently. Now, that last bit is the crucial point. The full 10-minute of occlusion didn't restore it like the intermittent group. It actually restored it the same as the bike flush alone. So there was no difference there. So it has to be the cycling of flushing, which is really, really interesting. I don't know if you've got a thought on that as a sports science background.
I've got more of a sort of physio and S&C background, but
sorry, apologies. Yeah,
yeah, no, I know it completely makes sense to me, like the physiology of why you would do it. I think my bigger curiosities are always, in a sort of neuromuscular sense, how, I don't know, neither of us, you're not at the current World Cup, so I know it's hard for you to answer, but like, how much, the question is always sort of a burning question on my mind is how much do you get players to lift? Because when you're in a normal season, there's a sort of loading aspect that happens just routinely. Most of the time, the games are pretty scheduled and pretty routine. Sorry, they're pretty routinely scheduled, I should say, to the sort of frequency of them.
Yeah.
And you can build a weekly schedule between them. Obviously, in the World Cup, there's a fairly regular cadence between the games. But you accumulate weeks at these tournaments in terms of time before the tournament, time at the tournament, playing. And obviously, the playing is the only important thing that really matters. But you are there for quite a considerable amount of time.
Yeah.
So I always kind of wonder, like, having not been to a tournament like that myself working, how much do you get players to lift? Like, how much do you allow them to sling weights around? Obviously, you're not trying to make them superhuman lifters during the World Cup by any means. But in terms of just maintaining some kind of homeostatic level of force capacity, or the sort of byproducts of that, how much do we get players to lift is the question I've kind of got, being a gym rat with my curiosities.
No, it's a really interesting question, and I personally wouldn't have an answer because I don't have the S&C background. But with that said, obviously what we're going to see is a primary focus on performance. So they're going to mitigate any heavy loading, or they're going to give a minimal viable dose to deliver what they're trying to at least manage and maintain their performance output or their physical outputs, right? But I would hazard a guess that if you tested them prior to and post competition, like the start of like weeks between, they're probably not as strong or powerful, or, I'd say some of their markers have dropped. Because you see it in season, don't you? You see where, over a rugby full season, when it comes to the actual in season, let's do football. Like, why would I speak about rugby? That was silly. It's a World Cup episode. But throughout the season, we do have to limit the amount we lift because we're focusing on the game at the weekend. We have to drop the strength sessions and give a minimal viable dose. And we do see drop-offs in, muscle strength, muscle size, muscle cross-sectional area. And it's been an area of interest for us actually in our research, whereby we've got a PhD student working on adding BFR sessions to actually give the signal and a dose without the load to manage that process, so that actually with 2 15-minute BFR lifting sessions a week, we expect to see at least maintenance, maybe even an increase in strength and power throughout the season, because they're still getting the signaling pathways triggered without the load on tissues. Therefore, there's no accumulated fatigue and CNS cost going into the game. So yeah, that's kind of, as a non-S&C, that's where my head goes with it.
Yeah, it's a fascinating World Cup as well. I think just the scale of it being across 3 different nations, and geographically the sort of like physiological challenge of all these different places is really different. And it must be a tall order for any team that, particularly the teams that don't have the luxury of being home nations, therefore they're traveling a lot more.
Yeah.
Because, you can get the schedule and you can make your plan for it. But at the end of the day, like, not every game is being played just in, say, the Northeast, where you've got a really consistent climate. 1 minute you're in the Northeast, the next minute you're in Dallas, really dry, very hot. The next minute, depending on the air conditioning, the next minute you're then in Mexico playing at altitude. Then you're, as England are now, heading to Miami in the tropics, essentially, at sea level. So it's just, how you build I understand how in a normal season you could look at arbitrarily like, okay, what were the GPS stats? What was our workload on field, in training, on the field? What did we do in the gym? How's the player presenting? How are they reporting their wellness? There's a lot of these different systems that the routine I think we're quite comfortable with now.
Yeah.
But then I look at the World Cup and I just question, like, how on earth do you do that when now, how do you compare two games? Like, you could look at the GPS for a game in Miami, you could look at the GPS for a game in Dallas, and then you could look at the GPS in Mexico. And like, even if the numbers are similar, that's surely going to still have really radically different effects on the body. So how
Yeah.
do you now then decide, okay, we're going to get the players to do a little bit of like minimal dose loading in the gym? How do you, other than just sort of going to the players, how do you feel and looking at response?
Yeah.
It must be so hard to build a system around that when you're away.
100%. I mean, the cost of you mentioned it there. If they cover the same high speed meters or same total distance, the cost of that is so different in higher temperatures versus lower temperatures, right? So, like, how do you even quantify that? And I honestly have an answer for that, but it's a really interesting conundrum that obviously coaches have put their minds to, better coaches than I. Um, and another interesting one is the altitude, I think. So, obviously, playing in Mexico last night, like I'm not sure if they had done some kind of altitude training in a hypoxic chamber or anything beforehand, but it takes weeks to acclimate to that kind of a hypoxic level. So have they done that? I'm not sure. What, like, did they even know they were going to be playing at altitude? Is this something they were hedging bets on? Like, it's a real tough thing to try and forecast, isn't it? And understand what we need to be doing with these athletes. So yeah, the Viagra maybe that's the secret weapon.
Well, we'll clip that.
Yeah.
Perception of fatigue was one of the things you mentioned, and probably sits really close to your wheelhouse. You've probably looked at that, I'd imagine, very closely with your background in BFR. But what's kind of like the full suite that you've seen teams using to kind of work on like the perception of fatigue, and actually like how does a player's muscles actually feel and respond to sessions, and how you kind of recharge that as much as you can while they're away.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of art to this. So there is science, of course, and for me, it's 50-50. Like, if a player's presenting with really sore limbs or really heavy limbs or really drained, there's three different recovery modalities I would choose, one for different things. So, if we're really sore, I'll chuck them in an ice bath, particularly if we're in high heats like they are in the US. If they're really heavy, we might chuck them in a sauna and actually get some heat exposure in there. All of these would also benefit from blood flow restriction for the work on record because it's a circulatory enhancer. But my point being, you would pick from a menu based on how the athlete is presenting. And I think that's super important because you got to play with the cards in front of you. You can't just cookie cutter, everyone's going to do this today if someone's presenting very, very differently. So I imagine they all have their own processes and, I guess, menu of options based on solid physiology to choose what to do in that circumstance.
Yeah. How I'm curious with you guys, how much I know you guys always have a ton of research going on with Hytro and BFR in particular. Um, how much of that is usually, or maybe is currently on like tissue loading effects? Like for years, and still, people mostly with tendons will load them with like heavy slow training, high force ISO. There's certain things that, like, for a tendon specifically, we do because we know it elicits an adaptation that's what we want in the tendon.
Yeah.
In recent years, obviously, BFR's become really useful for tendons. And I
Yeah.
can imagine if there's any player in the England team or any other team in the World Cup that has a ongoing tendon niggle, let's call it.
Yeah.
Like, they can
Yeah.
still train and play, but the tendon's a bit of a problem. BFR becomes a natural, great option for them because they can go low load. They have less logistics of what loading equipment they need as well. And they can
Yeah.
get a really good effect in the tendon, easy to recover from, perfect when you're away.
Yeah.
How much kind of other research do you have, or do you have ongoing research on like different tissue types or um, loading types like that, where it relates to sort of like certain injuries?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. So the research that we're focusing on with regards to tendons and tendinopathies is the priming side of things. So not actually training with the product to mitigate the load, but actually using it in the warm up. Because what we see is, and there's some really good literature around this, the analgesia, like the pain relieving effect of BFR, and it lasts quite a long time. It's up to 24 hours. So what we see is athletes adding it to their typical warm-ups or mobility drills or flows or whatever it is they have prescribed for their particular tendinopathy, let's say. Add some BFR into that, and we're going to see a more pronounced analgesic effect. So we see it a lot in footballers with knees, well, and ankles sometimes too, whereby they'll just even a wall sit. If you do a wall sit with BFR applied, you're going to find an analgesic effect from that. So in terms of logistics, that's really simple. A lot of teams will have kind of a leg extension in their changing room or something of that nature. And I've even seen coaches like sitting on players' legs to give them an isometric load while doing some kind of BFR. So it's been really creative. But the point being, our research is focused heavily on the priming element of the tendinopathy and helping them get into the match fixture with less pain and a higher pain threshold. So RPE is lower and they have greater range of motion and greater mobility in that game.
Yeah, I always find as well, like, and this is very anecdotal, but quite often when you work with athletes, I don't know, let's say it was like a patella tendon issue, the pain inhibition is definitely a very real thing where they need a really, they like a really gradual warm up of tendon loading. You can give them, a few minutes on the bike and some stretches and the usual kind of exercises. But I just find sometimes these kind of stiff, painful feeling tendons, whether it's the patella or Achilles, whatever it is, they need sort of like coaxing into activity. And I think BFR just really heightens that in my experience, because I think what's quite hard for athletes when they've got these cranky tendons is sometimes it can be hard for them to do isolated loading that allows them to feel a pump and actually that like, get the fatigue associated that you get, a metabolic sort of effect that you get from loading and doing sort of like hypertrophic type
Yeah.
loading. And I just find that like the lovely thing about BFR is you can get them doing something very gentle like a bike and give them
Yeah.
more pump in their quads or calf or something than maybe they've had in a while due to that pain inhibition and kind of reluctance to get into load. So
I think you've hit on a really important point there as well, like the reluctance or tolerance, let's say. When you feel that relief afterwards from releasing BFR, and you can actually score it, you can score your pain prior to and post doing BFR. It's just a definitive change. They're like, this has removed some of the pain, if not all of the pain. And when you have that feedback loop, you felt the stress and the uncomfortableness of the BFR and the movement that you were doing, and then afterwards you find this huge relief. You're like, it was worth it was worth the squeeze. And
yeah,
then all of a sudden it becomes a modality that's consistently used because they know the outcome, they know what it's going to be, and they can be uncomfortable for several minutes to get that outcome. Because honestly, I've seen players go from almost unable to run to sprinting after 10 minutes of BFR with some isometric work, and it's like magic almost. So yeah, I think that feedback loop is super important. I think that relieving sensation is what drives the buy-in from athletes.
from a kind of physio perspective, if I've got like an athlete with an Achilles or a patella, whatever it is, and so they've got some tendon stuff going on, I'm going to do the classic kind of 75 rep protocol, the 30, 15, 15, 15 type stuff with them
Yeah.
ordinarily. If you're kind of priming an athlete for performance, maybe in one of those body parts before they get out on the field, do you still follow that kind of those same parameters of reps and sets, or does it differ? I'm just wondering in terms of you want to prime them, but not fatigue them.
Yeah, exactly. So for me, I always go back to first principles and physiology. So what are we trying to do? We're trying to send a signal or trigger a signaling pathway in the muscle. They're not counting reps. They're experiencing a stimulus. So does it matter if it's 30, 15, 15, 15? Could it be a continuous cycle for 5 minutes, for 10 minutes? Could it be max reps, just 2 sets? Does it really matter as long as we're engorging tissues, we're creating that analgesia, and we're getting the muscle tissues and tendons stimulated? For me, it's the latter. And so long as we're doing that, we can be really flexible with the protocols. So while we are prescriptive to ensure that there's some kind of control over what we're doing and the athletes aren't confused, like you could do 5 different things. Now, we're very prescriptive, but in the coach's mind, they know that they can flex that to suit their environment. So if, for example, you're stuck in a changing room and there's no equipment available, you might just do body weight squats. You might do the 30, 15, 15, 15. Cool. That's a
Yeah,
perfect opportunity. If you have a bike available, it's a 10-minute continuous bike, right? It's really fitting it to what you have in your environment. The athlete doesn't need to know that you're flexing it. They just need to be told what they're doing. And in reality, the tendons and tissues are just responding to a signal. So I know that was a fluffy answer, and we will give you more definitives with the PhDs that we're funding, which we'll go into a bit, but we have 6 full-time PhDs looking at this type of stuff. We will have gold standard protocols for many different things, but right now, all we care about is triggering that signaling pathway.
Yeah, so you can, anecdotally, you can kind of define success in the set in terms of like, okay, if I get this athlete to, quote unquote, feel the pump, muscles feeling
Exactly.
gorged,
Yep.
then, and that's normally when they feel good, then actually in terms of reps and sets, maybe, pre-PhD results, maybe that doesn't matter as much.
Mm.
Um, we just go after that pump or whatever it is, and maybe this example. And then once they've achieved that, it's enough. We don't need to add in 2, 3 more sets because, why? Is there going to be a
Yeah.
return? Yeah.
I think, do you know what? I think that's one of the most important points that I'm trying to get across to the world right now. It's that science is important. I've done a PhD. I'm funding 6 full-time PhDs. We've just spent £500,000 on PhDs. Like, we're really heavily invested in that space. But for me, it's the practical application that is way more important. So at the end of the day, it's, are we triggering the signaling pathway? Are we driving the tissue to volitional fatigue or whatever it is we're doing? I don't care how we get there. I just need to know that we're getting there, because consistency will breed outcomes. If something's really surgically sterile and everything has to be a precise prescription, you'll find drop off because it becomes difficult to maintain. When you give that little bit of leeway and say, as long as you're operating between, let's say, 40 and 80% LOP, if we're talking BFR, and as long as you're taking the tissues to volitional fatigue or whatever it is, as long as you tick those 2 boxes, you're getting what you want from that protocol. So the PhDs will give us gold standards, but I would almost give a plus or minus standard deviation of like 20%, because in reality, in practice, does it matter as much? Now, I will caveat that and say, in research, it's important for standardizing those types of things so we can compare one study to the next. Totally appreciate that. I also think in rehab, it can be really important to give specificity to pressures used and rep ranges, because you've got $100 million athlete and we need to make sure we're making these notes and they're really clinically like sound. However, for anything more practical, like running on a pitch or, you know, just throw the BFR on and make sure it's at a safe and effective range and allow them to freedom to explore and be free to just take their tissues to the pump, I guess.
Yeah. So we've kind of gone through today. We've gone through, accumulated fatigue, jet lag,
Yeah.
neuromuscular function, perception of fatigue, or sort of like, how the muscles are feeling, loading in the tissues as well whilst away. Is there any other sort of big rocks that we haven't covered in terms of what considerations a team might have while they're away?
It's a good question. Should have really made notes on the side, mate.
I should have made notes as we go as well.
Yeah. It's just good to have a back and forth chat, isn't it? Um, I think there's a lot of teams, just in terms of going back to implementation, a lot of teams doing cold exposure while they're out in America to kind of mitigate soreness and make them feel fresher. Now I have a very strong stance on cold plunges in terms of when to use them and when not to use them. But I think that's been a pretty widely deployed mechanism over in the States at the moment, because you'll see the core body temperatures rising very high, like in those types of temperatures. So you'll see content of the Socceroos in the sea, where actually they were using BFR strapped in the sea. But the point being, they were reducing their core body temperature while having some fun, while also doing some BFR to enhance circulation. But yeah, for me, that as a strategy is really important in these high temperatures and high humidity places, because we need to reduce that core body temperature, because we see the reduction in performance. It's significant. It's several percent. So yeah, I think that's another strategy to explore.
Trying to sort of package it, and I know this is a huge "it depends" question, like a lot of them are. You mentioned earlier, like there's only so many kind of, I don't know how you worded it, but there's only so many asks, or that we put a lot of demands on these players for their recovery. Things have got to be practical.
Mm.
Uh, with physiology, is it about, within reason, trying to stack as many of these things as you can to aid recovery? Or can you, and I know it's dependent on the individual, can you go too far? Like, is it a case of like, let's aggregate as many and accumulate as many of these recovery things as we can and try and get as much as we can out of the player? Or can we kind of go over a threshold where now the psychological load is frustrating to them and we're losing the sort of positivity about what we're trying to achieve?
Yeah, and there's also the physical demand. If you're doing active recovery, there's a fatigue cost to that, right? So it depends how
Yeah.
much you're doing. If you do a 20-minute bike flush and an hour of mobilizing and stretching, and then some low intensity gym work, We've now done a full session if you accumulate the load, actually. So, yeah, there certainly is a ceiling to this. And also, I do believe in being pretty prescriptive based on how they're presenting and also using the data to understand what they should be doing. So I would never throw the kitchen sink at, I know I said it earlier, but I would never throw everything at an athlete. I would be very cognizant of what they've been through, so look at their data, how they're presenting, and then I would give them what I think physiologically would be the ideal things to change their tissues back to homeostatic levels. Um, so yeah, it really does depend on how they're presenting, but I don't believe we should throw everything at them at all.
When you've been kind of looking at recovery, maybe in the past, not the Football World Cup, but you've been away of rugby and different sports, do you sort of almost bucket the magnitude of these different menu options of kind of like, okay, I don't know, menu option 1 is all the biggest rocks. These are the things that we know statistically are going to have the biggest effect. So we want to have those as non-negotiables. And then maybe as we go into other categories, there's more flexibility on like, is the player pro or reluctant to do it?
Yeah.
You kind of tier things like that in your experience?
It's a really good way to put it. I'm not the biggest fan of scoring systems because they end up, it's a game, right? And they'll end up just trying to accumulate as many points as possible, and they'll do everything on the list to win the game, right? Which isn't really what we're after. Senior athletes don't, because they know their bodies, they know what works, but younger athletes may be trying to score their points, right? I've seen it before. So for me, it's being very definitive and prescriptive in the things that are going to move a needle for them and how they're presenting. But of course, like you mentioned, the big rocks, the big pillars, if we were to score, that's 95%, and that's sleep, nutrition, hydration, and mitigating stress, right? If we can do those things, we're mostly there. The other things are, I don't want to say cherries on top because they are meaningful and they can have a definitive impact on the game for sure. But time and sleep and nutrition are the biggest healers at the end of the day. So if I were to score, it would be 95 for those things and a mixture for the others. Now, what I have seen used really effectively is scoring systems that are dynamic. So on any given day, you'll have a higher score for a certain modality. So it kind of guides them psychologically to that modality. So when I worked in teams, I often found that a lot of people wouldn't do an ice bath because it's pretty brutal, right? There's people who love it. There's a huge middle ground of people who may or may not do it. And then there's a good 20, 30% who just will not touch them. But if we had that scored at like triple points one day, there's a reason for that. And that psychological kind of connection, they're like, oh, fuck, I better probably do that today. And I did see more in that middle bucket moving to the ice bath. So I think like flexi pricing on the trains and dynamic price and all that stuff, I think it works psychologically if we can just nudge them towards the stuff that we want them to do.
Yeah, because I can imagine if there's like, I'm going to call it trivializes it, but I'm going to call them like lower ticket items. Let's say, whether it is or not, let's say the Viagra supplementation for getting to an altitude.
Yeah.
Like, if the player rolls their eyes and is like more reluctant to do that, I think there's a sort of net effect of, okay, is pushing them and, nagging them and almost not forcing them, but like, if this is going to be a big ask, is the juice worth the squeeze of getting them to actually do this modality or this supplement or this thing if it's a low ticket item versus not making them do it? And does that just give them an easier ride mentally while they're trying to recover?
100%. I totally agree. We're working with humans, right? Science is science, but it doesn't help us connect with the human, and we need to make it connect for them. And they need to understand why they're doing something and how they're going to feel and what's the outcome from that and why they should do it. But I've seen athletes, even with BFR, right? I'll talk about my own business. I've seen athletes, loads of them resonate and buy into it, but a good handful don't. And that's fine. It's not for everyone because it's uncomfortable, right? So if you're stressed doing something, there's probably a net negative impact of that protocol. Ice baths, I see it all the time. They're like, get me out of this. It's awful. I don't want to do that again. Their cortisol's probably spiked. That's counterproductive for what we're trying to achieve. So it has to also lean into their cognitive biases. If they want to do something, they're probably going to get a more pronounced effect from that thing because their body's just allowing it, if that makes sense. It's not fighting a protocol. And I think you mentioned earlier the stacking of modalities. I love stacking because it's really time efficient, providing the physiology makes sense. So, for example, again, going back to that footage of the England football team using Hytro on the bikes, they've done that for years, to be fair, but they were doing bike flushes as everyone does for recovery. This research comes out and shows the magnified benefit of adding BFR. Well, cool. Now there's no more time added. We're just stacking two physiological mechanisms together to magnify each to get a greater outcome in the same given time. All we're asking them to do is strap in some shorts while doing the thing they were already doing. So again, their cognitive bias, I guess, goes to, well, I'm getting double bang per buck here. Same time, more outcome, give me more of that. And that's what I see with stacker modalities. So you can use it stretching, mobilizing, walking. You can use it in ice baths and swimming pools. And that for us has been a huge, huge win because it removes a friction. It removes additional time.
Yeah.
And you can stack other things too. I'm obviously talking about Hytro there, but you can stack other modalities as well. But I think it's a really good thing to do for time efficiency.
Where, you've worked in, you've worked in the field, you've done lab-based work, you've had your product, and you've been involved in work that's got into space. You've been
Yes.
in all these different like scientific frontiers looking at performance and recovery, particularly around BFR. Where are you most curious, or where do you think maybe the gaps are in recovery? Like, where do we sort of have the most work to do at understanding? Because I just think like you've got such a broad view on this kind of recovery and performance landscape.
Love that question. So we have two of our PhDs working full time on this question, and their literature review, which will be published soon, actually, for one of them. Shout out to Bailey. She's reviewed all of the recovery literature in sports essentially, and tried to rank and show the magnitude of effect. And it's actually surprisingly small. So people talk about all this literature around ice baths, for example. It's actually the most published recovery modality, but there isn't that many publications. I think there was under 100 anyway, something like that. I don't quote me on that. It's probably more, but we'll come back and check. But the point being, there isn't a lot. Then you look at things like recovery boots. There's none. There's no studies showing neuromuscular function or anything of like performance testing. There might be some on perceptual recovery, but there's none on performance. And yet it's so well embedded. Massage guns, same type of thing. Even massage, right? There's very limited evidence that it actually works. But crucially, people like the feeling and they do feel fresher. And there's a lot in that. For me, it's an art and a science, and that's the art side of it. If you feel better, then it's working, like definitively, in my opinion. So the question was, where do I think the space needs to go? I think we need to review all the recovery stuff that's out there right now and really understand the physiology and do some performance testing and actually validate, are these things working? And again, I'll tell you, that's what our two PhD students are doing. So we will have these publications in time. And you know what? If BFR comes second or third on the list, I don't care. It's definitely going to come at the top. But I don't care because
Yeah.
it's legitimate science. It's really sticking your neck on the line and saying, we're looking at this definitively. We're not saying, I feel great. I'm telling you, this restores function or it doesn't. And as a coach, you have to take that seriously because the amount of people using recovery boots, right? And all it really is, in my opinion, these athletes, they feel better. It's insane, right? And as a coach, you want things that are going to return to function. So hopefully we'll have some proper answers for you. And I think that is the first piece of work to do in recovery research, is to understand how things actually stack up and the magnitude of impact.
Yeah, I love that. I think the word magnitude is great, and like, magnitude of impact. I think probably also like the quality of the evidence is really important as well. Have you ever come across examine.com for new sort of nutritional stuff?
Do you know what? No, I'm a bit out of the game right now. So
I think it's examine.com, but it's a really good website where it looks at like every different type of like nutrient supplement that you could take. So you could click on, I don't know, like beta alanine as an example, and it will give you a table and it will tell you all the different cited benefits, like increased circulation, improved, muscle fatigue, all these different things. It's much more of like a generic population. It's not focused on elite athletes, but it's still really good. So it might be like creatine, beta alanine, all the different cited benefits, number of studies, quality of the evidence, magnitude of effect. So you all of a sudden will say creatine and it will have like 20 or 30 things that creatine may or may not do. And then it will rank them top to bottom in terms of like, okay, muscle strength and size might be near the top, cognitive function, but there might be other things that like maybe it could influence, but the magnitude of effect or the research that can prove that is just less. So it kind of falls down the list. But it's a really nice ranking system nutritionally. And I almost think kind of like as per what we've been saying today around tiering recovery modalities or tiering like recovery options, and then looking at like what works, what doesn't, and to what effect. Is it equal? Is it not equal? I think sports science could really benefit from that. But when you were talking about the PhD work, then it just really sort of echoed kind of maybe what I've seen there for nutrition.
That is a fantastic idea. So expect another examine.com soon, or just the Hytro website with the recovery stuff. That's really cool. I really like that. And I think it's really, it's genuine, kind of, it's genuinely doing research correct. Because at the end of the day, you see so many companies coming out with snake oil claims. Like, here's one, this really pees me off. When companies make claims and it's based on literature from like 30 years ago, but they haven't tested their own product, and it could be like a combination of beta-alanine, creatine, D-aspartic acid, throw everything in there. We don't know how they interact, right? But what they'll do is they'll make every individual claim and throw it into a wrapper and say, this product does this. And it's just simply not being tested. We don't know if that's true. And that for me is where a lot of the industry is, even some of the technologies, they'll just base claims on one research paper from a few years ago. And it's disingenuous. And
Yeah.
yet they'll sell so many products. So what, again, just going back to the ethos of what we're doing, really, it's just, it has to be underpinned by research, and it has to be genuine, legitimately done independently. And if we find something that, it might be a negative or it might be neutral, we're going to publish that, because we're in the business of pushing innovation forward. We're not here to just sell a product. We want to be trusted, credible. If something's wrong or something doesn't work the way we think it does, we want to know that and publish that so we can divert to a different direction. And that's the way companies should operate, in my opinion. And hopefully we're shining a light on that.
Well, we get it in the clinical world as well. Like there'll be, particularly in and around modalities and manual therapy based tools or techniques. There's just an absolute raft of ideas that are mainstream and popular with athletes or patients. And I'm not saying that any of them don't have a time and place and a benefit.
Yeah.
But more often than not, we're looking at a modality that essentially just puts heat into a tissue, and maybe has an effect on pain because it puts heat into the tissue, and it has we use a nice word of, it has a neurosensory effect. And then we've got all these different manual therapy techniques, like cupping, Graston, IASTM, the list is endless, now percussion guns. There's so many of these different things, and ultimately what we come back to again most of the time is it puts heat into a tissue, and it has a it has a neurosensory effect. And maybe there's the polite way to say it is there's a therapeutic alliance between the manual therapist or practitioner and the patient that basically it feels good. Patients like having soft tissue based work done, and it's popular, or the practitioner is then quite popular afterwards for doing it, and there's a sort of increased rapport and all the rest of it. But we're just kind of whittling all these like different, often oversold tools and products as being neurosensory and heat in a tissue. And sometimes just doing like 3 or 4 of them in a row with patients, because the patients or athletes like it, and they're all really doing the same thing. And I'm not saying that we shouldn't do it, but I think it's that kind of thing of like, look, if 1 of them or 2 of them work, great, do that with the athlete for a certain amount of time, because there's a benefit to doing it like more holistically. But stacking together 5, 6 of the same thing, I don't know if we get 5 times the effect.
Well, there's a difference between superficial kind of perception and feelings versus deep tissue, the vascular system being impacted. Like, those are stuff that's very deeply entrenched in the literature, in physiology literature. If you can manipulate circulatory like factors, we're going to see physiological changes. If you go to the top like few layers of skin and some of the not so deep tissue, it's superficial. Now you will feel better, and that's great. And I think there's a lot of stock in that, like I said before, and I think that's important for consistency, for buy-in. It's also behavior. If you've got a behavior of an athlete who does these things, they're probably eating better, sleeping better, programming this, everything better. So that's great. There's a whole holistic thing to look at. But look at the deep physiology. Is it meaningfully moving a needle or not? And that should inform our practice. Those should be the things we go to first. If they don't take to them, that's also fine, because there's a human side to this that I said. If you hate ice baths or BFR, don't do them. That's okay.
Yeah.
But be cognizant that they're probably 2 of the better things to do than this. So we Anyway, I'm going on one there.
No, it's great. Obviously, hopefully our listenership will be hearing a lot more of you and physiology in sort of weeks and months to come. Where can people follow you and find you sort of personally in terms of what you do professionally, not just Hytro, but all the stuff that you're up to?
Flick on BBC News, lads. It's on there right now. LinkedIn with Dr. Warren Bradley, and I think it's Warren Bradley Hytro on Instagram if you want to take a little look at that. There's some insights that I'm always sharing. Also, some challenging questions and hypotheses that I love debate on. So, if you want to have a chat and talk through some nerding out and some science, throw some comments in.
Cool. Well, really excited to kind of hear you doing some episodes and kind of see the people that you interview and talk to and kind of, what kind of knowledge we unlock from that. But mate, thank you very much for coming back on the show. And yeah, looking forward to getting you more involved.
Yeah, appreciate you, Andy. Thank you very much, buddy. And I'll speak to you soon.